Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. My name is Fadi Zatari. I am a research associate in Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Today we have the first book discussion for this semester. This is number 23. Sometimes we have books presented by the authors. Sometimes we present our stuff from the university, from the faculty members, new recent published book on issues related to SIGA's interest. Today we have two German books, one on Palestine directly, and the second one on the Jewish in Egypt. The second study is more historical studies. The first by Dr. Helga Baumgarten is more about Palestine and especially from 1948, from Nakba to the recent issue. We will start with Professor Helga Baumgarten. She is a well-known professor in Palestine. I know her from, I think, more than 12 or 13 years when I was doing my master there in Birzeit University. And she wrote many books on Palestine related to, for example, the Palestinian movement, Hamas and Fatah, the relationship between them. And she also wrote a book on Hamas, very known, very well documented book on Hamas. She has also a book on Yasser Arafat. And she also established the founder of the Democracy and Human Rights Master Program in Birzeit. Dr. Helga Baumgarten will present her in your recent book, the book called Keine Frieden for Palestina. This is published a few weeks ago, and I am very happy that I am one of the people who read the book. And I think it's a very important contribution. It's starting with the Nakba in Palestine and to the recent issue. For example, she even include the issue of Nizar Banat, a Palestinian activist who was trying to expose the Palestinian Authority, and he got assassinated a few weeks ago. So we are very happy to have you. You have 30 minutes, and then we will turn to questions. If you have questions, please post them, and I will be asking to Professor Helga. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fadi Zahtari. I'm very happy to have received this invitation, and I'm very happy to be hosted by you as a former student and now as a colleague. Thanks to SIGA and to Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, I'm happy to at least be with you via Zoom. I would prefer to be there in person, but in these Corona times, things are difficult. I should also thank you and your audience that you are introducing a book of mine which has been written in German and not, I'm afraid, in Turkish or English or Arabic. So hopefully we'll get some translations, but for the time being, you will have to do with my short presentation. I want to start with a small short focus on the history of this book. As you know, every single book has a history of its own, a very special history. My last book, No Peace for Palestine, The Long War Against Gaza, Occupation and Resistance, is a direct reaction to three recent events. Two of these events are located in Palestine. One of them is located in Germany. First of all, it's a direct reaction to what happened in Jerusalem in Ramadan 2021. The clashes of Bab al-Amud, the clashes in Haram al-Sharif, and finally the struggles against kicking out, removing Palestinians from their houses in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. The second issue is obviously the latest war of Israel against Gaza and against the people of Gaza. The third issue brings us to Germany. And actually, it's something I never thought would have the least importance. It's a brief interview of mine of just about 4 minutes on German TV. But what made it really important is the viral reaction it found on Instagram, where more than 3 million people looked at it and responded to it. So this reaction of millions of people in Germany was not expected by me. And at the same time, it made me learn a lot about the country where I was born, where I was raised, and where I grew up. Many of my German fellow citizens, actually I cannot keep track of their numbers, most of them Muslims with a family background in Turkey, in Palestine, in Afghanistan, and other countries, thanked me with emails. It obviously seemed to be for them something new, that there was open criticism on German TV by a German of injustice, and above all, the injustice of the Israeli occupation. It obviously was totally new for them that a German was presenting Palestinian Muslims in Jerusalem, all Palestinians there, as simple human beings who want to celebrate their feasts, and the Israeli army prevents this, who counter the extreme violence of the Israeli border police on Al-Haram Sharif, which was not only dreadful for them, many were injured, some of them very seriously, but above all, humiliating. And that I presented all those Palestinians as human beings who cannot but react to violence and humiliation with resistance. Let me go back to Germany. My fellow German citizens with a Muslim background wrote to me that they see themselves looked upon and treated as second-class human beings, as second-class citizens, branded by the media as they perceive it, as extremists, experience humiliation wherever they go. Well, all they want is respect from their fellow German citizens, respect in their human dignity. Now, the goal of my book has been to give an adequate response to this experience, to present the conflict in Jerusalem and in Palestine, which is so central to Muslims and to Palestinians, to Muslims all over the world, to Christians all over the world, to all decent human beings all over the world, from the perspective of the victims. So my perspective is a perspective of the victim, and to analyze it academically and critically in its historical depth. Now, for someone not from Germany, or for that matter from Austria or Switzerland, some explanations are in place. The problem in Germany is that to take up the history and the fate of Palestinians, either historically or contemporarily, runs counter to the official discourse. The official discourse in Germany is full support on all levels for the state of Israel. And any criticism of the state of Israel is almost invariably attacked as anti-Semitic. Now, fortunately, in the last few years, a counter movement has started in Germany by Germans, German Jews, Palestinians, it has started and will hopefully be able to become stronger and change this unacceptable state of affairs, this stifling of any serious debate. There is a group of German, a Palestinian, and an Israeli Jew who have started a court hearing against the Bundestag, the German parliament, where they protest against the decision of German parliament to make the BDS campaign boycott, divestment, sanctions, and to mark it as anti-Semitic and to forbid it. They have started a court case against it, and the court hearing will be on October 7. I do hope to contribute to this counter movement with my book, and I hope sometimes it's helpful to provoke in order to get a serious reaction and then to mobilize for freedom of debate, not least freedom of debate concerning Israel, its occupation over East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, the occupation which has lasted 54 years too long. We do need today serious and unrelenting criticism of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid in its Israeli version, and we need serious political steps to be taken, and they should be taken very quickly. How will I proceed? I will start with Gaza and the long war against Gaza. Will then move to my conceptualizations and finally see how much time is left before we move to the discussion. Back to my starting point, the war in 2021 against Gaza and my new interpretation. I see the war against Gaza in 2021 as the end, hopefully the end of a long row of wars which started in 2006 and had its last violent phase in 2021. It's a long war with hot phases, open and unbearably cruel and violent wars. 2006-7, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and last 2021. We do have in Gaza today a whole generation who has grown up and only knows war, violence, destruction, and unbearable living conditions. Now, for the Western press, all through this long war against Gaza, it is always Hamas considered the aggressor. Hamas and other organizations, Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian left, they are the ones, according to this narrative, who start violence against a peaceful state of Israel, which has to defend itself in order to protect its citizens. The reality of occupation and violence and continuous Israeli aggression is simply overlooked. And they do not consider what Nelson Mandela, who today is celebrated as a peace bringer, and they overlook that he started armed struggle in Palestine, South Africa. Mandela wrote in his memoirs, "It is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of struggle." So it's Israel who dictates the violence, not the Palestinians. This last war against Gaza in 2021 brought, like all previous wars, massive destructions. Homes were destroyed, buildings, high-rise buildings, hospitals, schools, mosques, and the victims were, like in all wars, above all, simple, peaceful citizens. Alain Crèche, the French journalist, formerly Le Monde Diplomatique, mentions that Israel is probably the only state which openly proclaims a doctrine of state terrorism, the so-called Dahieh doctrine, which was developed after the war against Lebanon in 2006. So he argues that several big powers do practice state terrorism, but none of them proclaims it as an official doctrine of state terrorism, like the USA in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other places, Russia, in Chechnya, and so on and so forth. Let me very quickly just give you a few numbers. There were in this last war against the Gaza Strip 250 Palestinian civilians killed, among them 70 children. More than 2,000 people were injured. And in comparison, on the Israeli side, there were 13 people killed, among them 2 children, and 120 were injured. So it shows you the lack of a balance between the biggest military power in the region and a poor, oppressed population and people in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. Now, the second new thing I try to do in my book is to analyze the history from 1948 until today, based on conceptualizations which most of my colleagues have started with over the last years. There is, first of all, the conceptualization of settler colonialism. What has very often been overlooked is that already in 1965, a Palestinian scholar, Dr. Fayez Sayer, analyzed Israel as a colonial settler state, but this was not entering the Western discourse. In 1966, Maxime Rodinceau in France published his book, first in French, Israël, fait colonial, and then in 1969, respectively, in 1973, in an English translation, Israel, a colonial settler state. Now, Rodinceau's books were extremely influential among the European left. They did not enter the general discourse. And they were very influential among the Palestinian left in Europe and were used by leftist organizations in Palestine and around Palestine, Israel, PFLP, and Democratic Front. Only much later, the classical literature on settler colonialism by Patrick Wolf in his book of 2006, and later Lorenzo Veracini in his book in 2010, entered a more wider discussion all over academics and specialists in the West. Now, what settler colonialism allows me to do is to draw a direct line between the driving out of Palestinians from the city of Eilat to Sheikh Jarrah in 2021. In my book, you can read a very detailed description of what precisely happened in June 1948 in Eilat as a direct order from Ben-Gurion and put into practice by his general and later on Prime Minister Rabin. And in my book also I give a personal description of George Habash, the later founder of Harakat al-Qawmi al-Arab and then the PFLP, and his experiences when he and his family and tens of thousands of people were driven out of Elit and walking in a big refugee trek to Ramallah. The second concept I have been using is the concept of ethnic cleansing. Now, obviously, this concept was used or started to be used all over in the context of the war on Yugoslavia in the 90s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the falling apart of Yugoslavia. Ilan Pappe is obviously the first one to apply this theory directly to Palestine in his book from the year 2006, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. However, Palestinian historian Noor Masalha used the term transfer instead of ethnic cleansing. But Uri Davis, a leftist Israeli activist, and don't be surprised, a militant inside Fatah, explained quite correctly the concept of transfer is ethnic cleansing in contemporary political parlance. So in his most important book, Noor Masalha, which he published well before Ilan Pappe, wrote about the expulsion of the Palestinians, the concept of transfer in Zionist political thought from 1882 to 1948. And I have to make a tribute here to my translator of a previous book, Palestine, Liberation into the State from 1991. My translator, Dr. Mohammed Abu Zaid, proposed that I should use ethnic cleansing. When he translated my book, I refused because I wanted to use the term which Palestinians themselves have used. I refused the conceptualization, and obviously this was my mistake, and Dr. Mohammed Abu Zaid was right. Finally, the concept of apartheid state. You probably do not know the person who first applied the term apartheid state to Israel. It was then South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, who in 1961 wrote to his Israeli colleagues, Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. He, however, considered this a compliment, while Israel at the time and until today refused vehemently to be classified as an apartheid state. Palestinians left in the 70s criticized the Bantustan strategy of Israel, and the Israeli leftist discussion from Uri Davis to Meron Ben-Vinisti always compared Israel's oppression of Palestinians to the oppression of the apartheid state of blacks in South Africa. Then in 2007, John Dugard, when he wrote about the legal consequences of a prolonged occupation, talked about features of colonialism and apartheid. In 2009, a very important and detailed study was published in South Africa under the title Occupation, Colonialism, Apartheid, a reassessment of Israel's practices in the occupied Palestinian territories under international law. He clearly This report clearly stated that Israel's policy in occupied Palestine corresponds directly to the international definition of apartheid. Now, unfortunately, neither Dugard's report nor the long study from South Africa had any serious impact on the international debate. Only in 2020, 2021, after 3 important human rights organizations published their report, was the term apartheid state for Israel accepted by many in the academic and the political discussion. The study of Yashdin, 2020, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem in 2021. Since then, Israel has been also in the North widely discussed and criticized as an apartheid state. What seems to be important for me in my analysis and for everyone analyzing and discussing Palestine is that Israel is no longer a singular exception, but can now be compared to other cases of apartheid states. Now, I have chosen a few major arguments of my book and want to suggest them for discussion. I guess I will have time only for one issue, the issue of armed struggle, respectively. How can one struggle against a power like Israel? Armed struggle by Palestinians against Israel was started by Fatah in 1965, and in the years 1965 until 1968, it was not really very relevant. The only relevance was that Fatah, from the beginning, made the first operation against the Israeli water carrier, that is, against the stealing of water by Israel from the Palestinians. Then in 1968, the Battle of Al-khatib came. Now, my argument in the book and also in previous books of mine is that Palestinians led by Arafat and by Fatah saw and have seen armed struggle, above all in its political relevance, as a strategy of mobilization and not so much as a long-term strategy of armed struggle against Israel. If we start with Al-khatib, Fatah did not follow guerrilla rules, which would demand that guerrillas withdraw from a strong army attack. They stood in place, they confronted Israeli tanks. 2/3 of all Palestinian fighters in Al-khatib were killed. From then on, their name all over the Arab world, all over the world, was Fidayun, Fidayin, those who sacrificed themselves for the liberation of Palestine. And Palestinians accepted, made a decision that armed struggle was the only way to liberate Palestine. However, King Hussein from Jordan, who in 1968 had argued and had said, we are all Fidayin, already in 1970-71, attacked the Palestinian resistance in Jordan violently, defeated them completely in Black September, and then in 1971 in Ajloun in the north. What has been overlooked is that at the same time, between 70 and 72, Palestinian resistance, led among others by the Guevara from Gaza, was defeated by the Israeli army under the leadership of Sharon in the Gaza Strip. So we have, within a few years, two major historical defeats of the Palestinians. The problem is that this issue of armed struggle, how it should be led, what can be achieved by it, has never been seriously and in depth discussed by Palestinians. We do not have any serious assessment of armed struggle from 1968 until the defeat of the resistance in Lebanon in 1982. My argument again is, and we can discuss this later, that this armed struggle for the Palestinians under the leadership of Arafat was actually political struggle with a goal to mobilize Palestinians for resistance, political resistance, civil resistance, diplomatic resistance against Israel. Arafat was quite clear. He said, we know that we cannot liberate Palestine with armed struggle, but we have to show to the world that the Palestinian people exists. The leadership in the West Bank, and I want to end here with one of the major leaders of the resistance in the West Bank, Abdel Jawad Saleh, mayor of the city of El Bire from 1966 until he was expelled by Israel in December 1973. Abdel Jawad Saleh argued, for us in the West Bank, the slogan "Only arms speak" has never been central. For us, political and cultural mobilization is the major thing. We need to build a nation. We need to build institutions. We need to mobilize and build resistance against occupation, nonviolent struggle to build up mass organizations. And I want to end with a song focused and based on the struggle of schoolgirls in the city of Jenin, who demonstrated against the Israeli occupation in 1974. The Israeli army attacked these schoolgirls with tanks, and one of the girls, Muntaha, 17 years old, was killed and overrolled by one of the tanks. Samih al-Qasim, one of the major Palestinian poets, wrote a poem on Muntaha, and Mustafa al-Kurd, who established the political song in Palestine, made a song out of it, a song which was presented all over Palestine, both in the occupied territories and inside Israel. And it ends with, a new school will be built in Jenin, carrying her name. Muntaha will continue to live until Palestinians are back as free human beings, as free people in their land. And I think now I should give the word to Dr. Fadi, and I am ready now to answer your questions. And I want to thank you, of course, for your patience for listening to my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. This is an excellent presentation, and I enjoyed it again. I think this is a very important contribution in German language, again, because it's presenting the victim perspective. I think there is a lack in literature in this aspect in German language, unlike maybe English or Arabic language. There are many questions. I would like to ask, because you already finished the book talking about the BDS as one maybe of the solution of how the Palestinians can continue their struggle. So maybe we can start with the BDS as one of the point. The second is you talked already in your book about how when Yasser Arafat was killed and Sheikh Yassin, when the Palestinian leaders, especially these two, beside Rantisi also, after that, the Palestinians, they start to have this problem of managing the Palestinian unity, and that led later, of course, to the election and to the split between Hamas and Fatah. So, of course, you wrote also an excellent book on analyzing the historical perspective on the conflict between Hamas and Fatah. So that was 2013, I believe. So I would love to hear also, what do you think? What is the new in this regard? Like, what would you update in the book in relation to the relationship between Hamas and Fatah? There is also one question about, I would read it, why are the Germans, particularly politicians and public figures, still shy away from supporting the just struggle of Palestinians? And why do they still cover the sense of Israeli occupation since 75 years after the Holocaust? Will that policy ever change, and how?
Okay, I will try to answer quickly so that we have time to cover as many questions as possible. The BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, which was started by Palestinians in Spain in 2005, is, I think, one of the most important movements in order to get support for Palestinians all over the world. And I think BDS has been quite successful, more in the Anglo-Saxon area, much less so in mainland Europe, France, or Germany. But things, I guess, are beginning to change, because we do have people now in Germany from the Solidarity movement who say BDS is a peaceful, non-violent movement, and there is no logic in not supporting, accepting, and legitimizing this non-violent movement. The struggle is going on, and as I said, this court hearing will be on October 7th, and we can all on Zoom participate in the press conference after the court hearing. Secondly, BDS, I think, has achieved major inroads, above all in the United States. And I want to refer here only to Jewish Voice for Peace in Israel. We have the same movements also in Germany, Austria, and in Switzerland. Now, in the United States, one of the most important younger spokesmen for the Zionist movement, Peter Beinart, in the last 2 years changed completely. And this is a major change which has been going on in the United States and is very important for Palestinians. Peter Beinart is now supporting a one-state solution, because he says the two-state solution is not possible, and secondly, does not give full equality to Palestinians in Israel. So he wants a one-state solution with full equality for all citizens in this state, Palestinians and Israelis. And since 2021, he supports the right of return, because he says Palestinians were driven out against all international law in 1948, and based on international law, they must have the right to return. And I think BDS has played a very important role. If you go on the website of Peter Baynard, you see a very important discussion between him and Omar Barghouti, one of the founders of BDS. Second question, the split between Fatah and Hamas. Well, obviously, this split came about as a direct intervention by the West, led by the United States, after the election victory of Hamas in 2006. Unfortunately, Palestinians, and above all, the blame here should be put on Fatah, did not refuse and reject this Western intervention, but went along with it and thought they could be successful in not accepting the election victory of Hamas. Now, we all know the split happened. Since 2007, we have the Gaza Strip under the rule of Hamas, and we have the West Bank under the rule of Fatah. Now, I've argued before that whenever Fatah and Hamas tried to overcome the split, there was intervention either by Israel or by the United States, either led by Israel and then followed up by the United States, or started by the United States and then followed up by Israel, with pressure on Ramallah, and the overcoming of the conflict never happened. Now, last year, not only myself, I think many people, and probably also you in Istanbul, thought with this big conference and meeting in Istanbul and the direct link to the meeting in Ramallah, the split would for good have been overcome, and that all the Palestinian organizations led by Fatah and Hamas would finally opt for elections, opt for a new parliament, opt for a new president, opt for a new Palestinian council in order to put things on a new base, and in order to be able to move ahead with a program which all Palestinians would support and become successful in their resistance against occupation. We all know Mahmoud Abbas decided to not have elections, and since then the split once again came up, and we are now in a situation where things are worse than before. We had this brief period in May, June 2021, the demonstrations, the fightings in Jerusalem, then the war, or the fighting starting from Gaza, Saif al-Quds, and the war of Israel against the people in Gaza, which led to a brief reunification. But today we are back with the split, and it seems that there is no readiness to try and overcome the split. The split seems to be more supported by Fatah in the West Bank than by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but I think both parties have to be blamed. The interesting thing is that people both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank are absolutely against this split, and they are blaming not least Mahmoud Abbas for the split. And the latest poll we have from last week, as a matter of fact, no, not from last week, then from this Tuesday, 78% of Palestinians want Mahmoud Abbas to resign. This means, of course, that 78% of Palestinians, at least, if not more, are against the split. But we have Fatah supported by, and Abbas supported by Israel, by the United States, funded by the Europeans, and with a strong secret service. So I do not see, for the time being, any chance for any change. Last question, German politicians, why do they still refuse to support Palestinians? Well, a good question, which we should pose directly to German politicians. First of all, there are quite a number of German politicians who are supporting Palestinians, but they are meeting a lot of criticism from their fellow party members, be it in the Christian Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, the Green Party, and the left. Why do they still support Israel? In my interpretation, it has two reasons. Number one, Germany, despite the claim that they have been able to deal in the right way with their attempt to destroy Jews in Germany, in Europe, all over the world, what we call the Holocaust or the Shoah in Hebrew. I think they have not succeeded in doing this because success in dealing with the Holocaust would mean that there is no possibility for racism and new racism in Germany. Now, as we know, that instead of racism against Jews, and we know there is still anti-Semitism in Germany, now we have racism against Muslims in Germany, Islamophobia. And as a study of my colleague Matthias Steinberg, who at the time was in the United States, who is now in Vienna, showed quite clearly, Islamophobia is supported by exactly the same structure of arguments than anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s. Now, German politicians have a bad conscience towards Israel, and for this reason, they support Israel and do not dare to criticize it, and do not dare openly to support Palestinians, unfortunately. And we hope for a change.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned already Peter Bernard. I think he wrote his book, The Crisis of Zionism, more than 15 years ago, where he predicted that there will be a change in the future among the young generation. They will not be engaged anymore in Zionist, and that will be dangerous for Israel. So we have one question related to this, like we are witnessing in West, and here the question in Germany, for example, more change, more support to Palestine, especially in the public level. So the question said, part of the question, how can this unjust conflict can be managed at the popular level? So how can we make more changes on the individual level? For example, maybe the BDS, etc. So how you will comment on this?
Well, I think most of the changes, interestingly enough, are happening at the moment in the United States. The fronts there are quite clear, and for the first time, these changes have reached a party represented in Congress, both in both houses of the Congress. They are still not strong enough, as we saw in the defeat of the motion that the United States should not fund the Patriot system, the Iron Dome system in Israel. It was supported by a majority also of the Democratic Party. But as I said, things are changing in the United States on the popular level. Changes are taking place inside the universities. Changes are taking place even on the level of political parties, political organizations. And we have now people watching this in polls. One of them is a Palestinian from Nazareth, Shibli Talhami, from Maryland University, if I'm correct, who is having a regular poll and who has been showing that the support for Palestinians and the criticism of Israel has been growing tremendously in the United States. It has not yet been fully translated to the political level, but it's moving. Europe is lagging behind. So we do have struggle on the popular level in Germany, facing a lot of difficulties. It's still possible in Germany, when you want to make a presentation on BDS, that you are not rented a hall which is funded by a city or by the government. However, whenever the people go to court, they win the case. So I would say publications, hopefully like my book, writing articles, speaking in presentations, and many of my friends and colleagues are doing this, confronting politicians all over and whenever it is possible. This will bring about change. And I mean, I have received quite a number of emails from politicians on the middle or lower level who say, we are with your interpretation and we need to continue the struggle. In Germany, we are at the beginning, but things might change more quickly than in the last 20 or 30 years. At least that's what we hope for. And I think there are many people now in Germany who are fighting for it.
Okay, I still have several questions, but I will go one by one, maybe if we still have time. Of course, you wrote a book, it's called Kind of Freedom for Palestine, No Peace for Palestine. And it started from Nakba to the recent event in Palestine. So how do you see now the future of Palestine in relation to Israel more?
Well, I think one of the major achievements of summer 2021 is a mobilization and a unification of Palestinians all over the world, and more support for Palestinians also all over the world. Now, the big question is, how can this level of mobilization among Palestinians be maintained, and how can this international solidarity be maintained? We have the latest case, the breaking out into freedom of 6 prisoners from a high security prison, Gilboa prison in the north of Palestine, Israel. They were recaptured, but again, they mobilized people all over. We are speaking now of a freedom tunnel. We are speaking about the struggle for freedom from the prisoners, and in a way, they, I think, they are a symbol for the Palestinian condition, moving out and liberating themselves with a tremendous achievement from a high security prison. But then when they are out in the bigger prison, there is no adequate support structure, and then they get recaptured. But we do have the symbol that it's possible to achieve freedom. And I think this symbol achievement, which we also had in May 2021, the ongoing struggle on Al-Haram al-Sharif, the ongoing struggle in Sheikh Jarrah, the ongoing struggle in support of Nizar Banat and asking for the responsible people to be put before court. I think all this shows us that struggle of Palestinians will continue, will become stronger. Now, obviously, I cannot determine what kind of struggle Palestinians will use. It will be their decision on the ground, but I do see this unification going on. What we can do on our part is to continue fighting, to keep up international unwavering solidarity and militancy in order to achieve political change by pressuring our governments wherever we live.
Okay, thank you again. One more question sent to me several times to ask about the normalization with Israel. So how do you think this impact on the Palestinian case? Do you think this is like really affecting the Palestinian negatively, or you think it's on the side? What is your thought on the normalization, especially with the Arab normalization with Israel?
Well, obviously, both Palestinian support for normalization, not least led by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, but also on the level of individuals, of parts of the business community, has been extremely negative. And also the so-called Abraham Accords, that is normalization in inverted commas between Gulf states and Israel, has certainly not had any positive impact. On the contrary, normalization on the ground, starting with the Tansiq al-Amni, the security cooperation between Ramallah and Israel, and the exchange of ambassadors between the Gulf and Israel, has only supported authoritarian governments and has certainly not supported the struggle against occupation, or has achieved any achievement in terms of ending the occupation and achieving freedom for Palestinians.
Okay, since we have still, I think, a few minutes, there is also one question about the armed struggle against Israel. Someone asking, like, the struggle against the brutal occupation is legitimate from the UN perspective. So how do you think this is effective? Do you think this is will be useful and effectively for the Palestinian, or they should focus on other things? What do you think?
Well, it's a very, very difficult question, because we do have on one hand the right for all oppressed and occupied and colonized people to resist with all means. This is one side. The other side is that international law prohibits violence against civilians. Now, here we have the dilemma, because when Palestinian organizations are shooting rockets against Israel, these rockets, in most of the cases, hit civilians and not the military. So there is the big question how to deal with it. Obviously, there is a difference if there is a rocket in self-defense by Palestinians oppressed and under colonialism and hitting civilians, and the Israeli army as the colonizer who is hitting civilians in the Gaza Strip. There obviously is a difference, but this question Palestinian organizations will have to deal with. The same thing refers to the whole history of armed struggle in Palestine, and at the same time, one has to ask the question, what is the best strategy to defeat one of the strongest army in the world? Do you try to achieve equality, or do you try to hit them on the level where they are weak? So again, I cannot decide this. This is a decision which Palestinians have to make. I can ask the questions, and the questions are, and the thing which has to be discussed, what is most effective in order to end occupation, in order to achieve freedom, in order to achieve freedom for all Palestinians from the Galilee via East Jerusalem, Ramallah, Jenin, Al-Khalil to the Gaza Strip.
Okay, thank you very much. This was the first presentation, 60 minutes, and we are finished with this. Thank you, Professor Dr. Helga Baumgarten from Birzeit University. I enjoyed this very much. Despite the fact I read the book, but this is also more thing to think about them. Inshallah, we will have you next time in Istanbul, and we will be sitting together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the audience, to all the questions, and I do hope the book will sooner or later be available in translation, be it Arabic, Turkish, English, whatever, so that all of you can read the book. Thanks again, and until the next time in Istanbul, inshallah.
Thank you very much. Now our next speaker will be Dr. Taqadum Al-Khatib. Dr. Taqadum Al-Khatib, he will present his also new recent published book on in the Juden in Egypt, the Jewish in Egypt, and Dr. Taqadum Al-Khatib is from Free University of Berlin from Germany. Taqadum, Dr. Taqadum Al-Khatib, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fadi. And thanks also for Asija for this invitation to present my book, which actually is my dissertation, which I studied between Germany and Princeton University in the States.
Dr. Taqadum, can we see you? The camera is not open.
Actually, sorry, I'm so sorry.
Okay, great. Now we can see
you. Okay, thank you so much. And my book actually, it was, as I said, which I studied between Free University of Berlin and the Princeton University, and it has been published by the German academic press, Hagassowitz Verlag. My dissertation actually, I have written this dissertation in English and in German. The English edition will be publishing this year or the next year, and Arabic translation in progress. My book is based on analysis of newspapers in Arabic, French, and Hebrew, including the rabbinic newspapers Israel, 1919-1934, and Ash-Shams, and the Karaiti newspapers Al-Ittihad al-Israeli and Al-Kalim. My book actually studied the relationship between the state and minorities in Egypt, in particular the Jewish community in the so-called liberal age that began with the 1919 revolution and the drafting of the 1923 constitution and lasted until 1952. The book seeks to answer a major questions. What was the relationship between the Egyptian state and minorities? What was the basis and form of this relationship, and what factors determined and draw its boundaries? Did minorities in Egypt enjoy religious and political freedom in the past? Has the status of minorities changed, and why? The political and social discourse of various political groups was forged as these questions came to the fore with the 1919 revolution. This discourse also attempted to answer an important questions about the identity of these political groups, and this was especially true of Jews in this period, who gave different answers to the questions of whether they were Egyptians, Jews, or Arabs. This raises a further question. What was the position of Jews in the Egyptian society between 1915 and 1952, specifically during the interwar period? Was it entirely different from other minorities such as the Coptic minority? I tried also in the introduction of my book to give an overview about the historical problem of the Egyptian society, because the same questions that we have asked during the Egyptian uprising, there was the same one that has been asked also during the 1919 revolution. Since the 1919 revolution, several questions have continued to be asked in the Egyptian state and society. The Arab Spring uprisings made these questions newly relevant, though they remain unanswered. They include such issues as the status of minorities in Egyptian society, Jews then, Copts today, and their relationship to the state and society's attitude toward minorities, the prevalence of nationalist thought in the economy and society, and its impact on both the meaning of Islamic renewal, anti-colonialism, and national independence, and the attitude toward the Palestinian cause. The Arab Spring added the issue of human rights, which became a prominent subject of discussion. In the period between 1952 and 1915 and 1952, Egypt was the Jewish spiritual center in the Middle East. The largest number of Jews, especially from wealthy families, lived in Alexandria and Cairo. This concentration of Jews in Egypt illustrates the divisions within the Egyptian community at the time due to the doctrinal differences and the heterogeneous origin. In general, the difference between the followers of Karaiti and Rabbanic group is not in the content of the faith, but in ritual, language, work, and culture. The socio-cultural framework of the Rabbanic Jews consists of two elements: the oral law, halakha, with its combination of ritual studies and legal aspects, which held the Jewish people together and provided a symbolic institutional continuity of the Jewish national cultural identity. In this context, Hebrew, however, represented the second element that allowed the Jews to keep their context. The Karaiti Jews rejected the oral law, halakha, and the mixture between the oral law and the written law of the Old Testament, which later led to what became known as the dispute of Minhagim. In an interwar climate characterized by a lack of discrimination against minorities, divergent political movements emerged in Egypt in this period, including Young Egypt, the leftist vanguard, the feminist union, and communist groups like the Egyptian Movement for National Liberation, Iskra, and Hadithu in the 1940s. I will explain that also, which saw strong minority involvement, especially by the Jewish minority, as well as political Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, formed in 1928. Zionism also, to be benefited from this lack of discrimination and general political freedom, and was promoted by Jewish bourgeois intellectuals like Sephardi intellectuals who had a close tie with the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, and others who frequently visited Egypt and engaged in a dialogue with Egyptian Jews to gain their support for Zionism. They tried to spread both Hebrew language and Zionist objectives simultaneously. In some ways, Zionism was a new and distinct issue which divided the Egyptian Jewish community in novel ways. The relationship between the state and its minorities, which in this period was based on the principle of citizenship, was undergirded by concepts like freedom of expression, national independence, and representative democracy, as well as the right to issue newspapers, part of a system of expression guaranteed by the 1923 Constitution. My study also explores the relationship between citizenship as a concept, which was first codified in law in 1923, and practical attempt to apply it, looking at the obstacles encountered, particularly in the courts, although state reform attempts to consolidate the judiciary into a uniform system were ultimately unsuccessful. Historically, it remains an important experiment. It was the sole attempt in modern Egyptian history to lay the foundations for a secular system based on the separation of religion and state, and establish a value system grounded in human rights. And this even before the drafting of United Nations Human Rights Convention. This episode also reflects the dynamic governing the relationship between the state and minorities in this period. The Jewish community itself was highly diverse, speaking multiple languages depending on their origin or from where they immigrated. The upper class, for example, was educated at good schools and spoke several languages, especially European languages. However, Hebrew was not as popular. The middle class spoke French as the first foreign language of choice, in addition to English, Italian, and Greek. And this is also reflects the linguistic diversity inside the Jewish communities in Egypt. The book tried to clarify how bourgeois intellectuals allied with the state and asserted hegemony over their respective minority communities, and understand the relationship with the state and their interactions with their own social milieu. Religion in the 1923 Constitution. It is a very important point because several minorities in Egypt took place in drafting the 1923 constitutions. As noted in Article 149, the Constitutional Committee affirmed Islam as the official state religion and Arabic as the state primary language, which was reasonable and consist with a social context in which Islam was the religion of majority. The Constitution only affirmed that Islam was the official religion. It defined no rule for it in legislation or in determining the identity of the state and its institutions. As such, Islam played no role in personal status matters like marriage, divorce, and inheritance, which were addressed by the communal councils. This stands in contrast to the 1971 Constitution under President Anwar Sadat, which added a provision defining Islam law as the principal source of legislation, and so giving it a role in lawmaking and in public life generally. The 1923 Constitution also specified Arabic as the official state language in the historical context in which the Constitution was written. This was meaningful. The liberal elite who helped draft the Constitution were nationalists who asserted that linguistic and geographic and historical continuity, that is, a connection through time and place, with the bond uniting Egyptians into a single polity despite their different religions. This elite sought to set itself apart from the religious current, which claimed that Islam was the common political factor uniting all Muslims in Egypt and the world. This trend included people like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, Sheikh Rashid Rida, and Mustafa Kamel, the head of the National Party, who saw no contradiction between national affiliation and religious identity. In the first chapter, I discussed the relationship between economic modernization and Egyptian nationalism, and I will explain also why. most scholars researching this, the history of Egyptian Jews focus on the high bourgeoisie, given that class's strong representation in politics, the economy and culture, and their close ties to the state and its institutions. The majority of this class were Rabbanic Sephardic Jews. They dominated other Jewish communities such as the Karaiti and Ashkenazis, and played a prominent role in Egyptian cultural, political, economic, and social life and economic modernization. In regard to the press, under the publication law of 1881, these intellectuals established private newspaper as a platform for the discussion of issues relevant to their religious communities, as well as the general political situation in Egypt. They also established Jewish schools that helped to revive Hebrew, many of which were later linked to the Zionist movement and spread its ideology, like the schools affiliated with the Alliance Israelita Universelle. This is a French school, and I will explain in the fourth chapter the role of these schools. This is a reflection of the reality that existed from 1919 to the tripartite aggression when the United Kingdom, France, and Israel invaded Egypt in 1956. And it showed how the general climate at the time facilitated the Jewish integration into Egyptian society. The focal point, and also the personal point of view, is that the rise of nationalism in Egypt related to the modernization in different sectors, especially state administration and the educational system. Thus, it helped the Egyptian elite to put themselves in touch with Europe. Examining the Jews as a migrated minority who came to Egypt from different countries will help to understand the plurality of political affiliation among among Jewish communities, more so their upper class who had invested in different sectors and held strong ties with the Egyptian government. For example, for this relationship between Jewish communities and the Egyptian governor, the president of Sephardi Jewish Community Council, Yusuf Aslan Qattawi Basha, was cabinet minister twice, 1942, 24, and 25, while Murad Faraj Bey, the president of the Karaiti Jewish Community Council, was the royal attorney. Furthermore, the social structure of the Jewish community explains the correlation between the social class and their political orientation, although it was by no means a statical model wherein every class had a genuine political orientation. It illustrates that Jewish intellectuals who were involved in the economic, social, and political and cultural life belonging to the upper class. In that response, the economic power does have a huge impact on the religious and political orientation. The upper class, which dominated the other classes on different levels, especially the conciliar bodies, through which a communal council known as Al-Majlis Al-Ta'ifa or Al-Majlis Al-Milli governed the different Jewish groups. The internal electoral system of the community council based on the communal tax. To be eligible to vote for the council, one had to pay the tax known as Al-Arikha. This is a Hebrew word for 3 consecutive years. The volume of tax depended upon a person's income. Paying a higher tax ensured voting in elections, thus gaining control over the council. So inevitably, the Majlis were dominated by the wealthy. In the second chapter, I discussed the identity crisis of embracing Zionism or continuing loyalty to Egyptian nationalism amongst Rabbanic and Karaiti Jews of Egypt. I gave also a short history about the establishing of the Zionist movement. In 1889, Charles Baghdadi founded the first Zionist organizations, Bar Kokhba in Alexandria. Its members came from Ashkenazim and Sephardim groups. Unfortunately, there are no exact details on the statistics of members. In 1915, Vladimir Jabotinsky, a Jewish Russian journalist, in World War I, founded a military wing under the British Army in Burj Al Arab, west of Alexandria, under the name of Kata'ib Abna Sohyun. In Alexandria, there was also the Zionist committee chaired by Edgar Sawaris, who later worked with the Zionist committee in Cairo. After the Balfour Declaration in 19 17, their cooperation became stronger. The Zionist movement in Egypt, like the communist movement, included numerous contentious issues and sometimes conflicting points of view. There were cultural Zionists, political Zionists, practical Zionists, and revisionists, just as in Europe and Palestine at this time. The cultural Zionists, for instance, reflected on the use of the language, which Zionist groups stressed the use of Hebrew as a national language for the Jews. The aim was to learn the Hebrew language. Consequently, they built a language school, which in turn led some of the Jewish families to send their children to this and other new language schools in order to learn Hebrew alongside European languages. Furthermore, they established several Hebrew schools, especially the religious schools, and approached Jewish families to send their children there. The problem of language, or the so-called Sprachkampf in German, a language debate spread among Egyptian Jewry alongside a project of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, in which the Karaite community and the Sephardic Zionists supported the opinion of the Zionists and the Yishuv. Yishuv means here the construction of the Israeli society in Palestine. And they stressed that Hebrew had to be the language of general instruction and the language of education at the Hebrew schools. The political Zionists also reflected on the cleavage among the Sephardic Jewry around Zionism, which was more marked among them than in the Karaite community. This cleavage extended itself to include the Chief Rabbi of the Sephardic community, Nahum Effendi, and we have conflicting information about the attitude of the Sephardic Chief Rabbi towards Zionism in Egypt. Some data indicated that he rejected to participate in the Zionist movement, and some information or data also indicated that he engaged strongly with the Zionist leaders in Egypt. The appearing of Zionism as a national movement divided the Jewish communities and leaves the importance of nationalism, especially for the Egyptian Jewry, ambiguous. The spreading of Zionism also highlighted the problems within the Jewish groups in Egypt and put them at the center of communal tension. Under this impact of Zionism as a national movement, the meaning of nationalism had different forms, and some of the Jewish intellectuals were torn between two nationalisms, the Egyptian nationalism and Zionism as a national movement. At that time, what does exactly Egyptian nationalism mean? In this period between the two world wars, the Egyptian political resistance to the British colonial rule was rising simultaneously. The presence of the British occupation supported the discussion about social and political sentiments in Egypt, especially the questions where the country had to be considered an Islamic state or was predominantly shaped by the secular ethics of the British regarding social and political issues. During the British occupation, the issue of gaining citizenship was a problem for the minorities in Egypt. Egypt had left dhimmi as a term of foreign people. Two reasons contributed to this new concept. Firstly, the Turkish Caliphate left the land of Egypt to the new colonial power. The success of the Egyptians in forcing the king to construct a draft committee of the constitution and organize the parliamentary election was the second reason. This 1990 revolution, or during the 1990 revolution, the concept of muwatana, citizenship, emerged because of the struggle of Muslims, Christians, Jewish Egyptians, and several other minorities. At that time, an inclusive party, the Wafd, brought together various segments of Egyptian society, including minorities. As a matter of course, both Copts and Jews joined the Wafd party and reached a leadership position within it. For example, Coptic intellectual Marcus Hanna became party secretary in November 1919, and the party boasted many Coptic members. Looking at the role of minorities, particularly Jewish businessmen in Egypt's economic modernization, brings us to a discussion of the role of foreigners in ending colonization and the role of foreign companies in decolonization generally. The national movement included several intellectuals who adopted and participated in what was called Al-Nahda, or the Arab Enlightenment. The most distinctive term used in Al-Nahda discourse was Islah. It focused on language, religion, society, government, education, or family. And all of minorities in Egypt participated in this discourse alongside a majority also. For example, Murad Faraj Bey, the president of the Karaite Jewish Community Council of Cairo, was one of the best known Jewish intellectuals who participated in Al-Nahda and the social reforms. Arab scholars who studied the contributions or the history of Jews in Egyptian society over time have come to contradictory conclusions when examining the Jewish influence on Egypt. The first conceded that Jews were an important part of Egyptian society and played a major role in the cultural, political, and economic life in Egypt. The second stance tried to determine the Jewish influence through Zionist activities, while acknowledging that some of them worked against Zionist propaganda by way of the Jewish anti-Zionist groups. The biggest controversy arose around the communist movement, which included intellectuals from both Rabbanic and Karaite groups who contributed to establish this movement as part of their struggle actually against Zionism. Karaite intellectual, for example, Yusuf Darwish, the grandfather of the Egyptian actor Basma, played a leading role in the struggle against Zionism through his own periodical, which has been published in French, and he worked alongside Abdulrazak al-Sanhuri and other Egyptians against the spreading of Zionism. The communist movement consisted of three groups: Al-Haraka al-Masriya Lit-Tahrir Al-Watani, the Egyptian Movement for National Liberation, Iskra, and the Citadel Organization. During this period of the global economic crisis and the rise of fascist powers in Europe caused a stir in Europe, which is why many minorities joined forces: Jews, Greeks, Italians, and Armenians, but also Muslims, mainly intellectuals who established
Somehow we cannot hear you anymore.
Do you hear me just now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I will start from the communist movement actually again. The communist movement consisted of three groups: Al-Haraka al-Wataniya Lit-Tahrir Al-Watani, the Egyptian Movement for National Liberation, Iskra, and the Citadel Organization. During this period, the global economic crisis and the rise of fascist powers in Europe caused a stir in Europe, which is many minorities joined forces: Jews, Greeks, Italians, and Armenians, but also Muslims, mainly intellectuals who established numerous magazines to support the Marxist movement. Henry Corell, for example, the leader of the Egyptian Movement for National Liberation, contributed to establish various newspapers on the communist movement, such as Tahrir al-Sha'b, Liberation of the People, Al-Majalla Al-Jadida, New Magazine, and Al-Asbu' the Week, and At-Tatawur, Evolution. Several Jewish communities, such as Ezra Harari, financed and established small groups among Jewish and other students in order to fight against Zionist activities within the Jewish community. After the rooting and spreading into the three groups, the Egyptian Movement for National Liberation, Iskra, and the Citadel Organization, they integrated these and built further association in 1947 called Al-Haraka al-Wataniya Lit-Tahrir Al-Watani, National Liberation Movement, or Hadithu, which was the largest communist organization in modern Egyptian history. It encompassed the communist students movement and the workers movement, distinguished by a strong position against Zionism and its in Egypt, and its members also in Egypt rejected the division of Palestine. Several Egyptian Jews did participate in both national movements, like Leon Castro, who conducted the propaganda for Wafd Party in Europe after the 1919 nationalist uprising, and founded and edited Abu French language newspaper. After returning to Egypt, he did conducted this newspaper. He was simultaneously at the head of both the Zionist Organization of Cairo and the representative of the Jewish Agency for Palestine in Egypt. We have another example also, Felix bin Zakin, who was a member of the WAFD, a deputy in parliament, member of the Alexandria Rabbinical Court, and president of the Zionist Organization of Alexandria, all at once. Despite his Zionist commitments, bin Zakin remained in Egypt until 1960 when he immigrated to the United States. The first thing that I discussed in my book also was the topic of building schools as a part of the Egyptian educational system. Zionist movement aroused national sentiments and insight into the need to revive a national language. Both poor and wealthy families, the wealthy being mostly Sephardim, as I mentioned above, worked with the Zionist committee to build religious schools. The wealthy families in Alexandria, on behalf of their community, wrote to the Alliance to ask, I mean here, Alliance Israelita Universelle, to ask the organization to open schools in Egypt. Egyptian Jewish intellectuals were associated with the International Jewish Organization. And most of the Sephardi intellectuals group were or involved and promoted in the Zionist movement and promoted the dissemination of Hebrew and the Zionist culture within the Jewish communities. In 1926, the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann visited Egypt with a delegation of education experts to observe the living condition of Egyptian Jews. The delegation visited the schools and Jewish places like Harat al-Yahud, Imuski, and Al-Gamaliyah. The European schools in Egypt, especially the Alliance, played a crucial role in the educational system and in the administrative also system. European rule over the Middle East and North Africa and the process of westernization that accompanied it formed the general context in which the modern encounter between the West, North Africa, African Sephardim, and the Egyptian and the Eastern Jewish communities of the Muslim world took place. For the Sephardim and Eastern Jews, Mizrahim, the most important and central impetus for cultural westernization came in most areas, especially the French Jews working throughout the Alliance with its vast schools network in Muslim countries. That might explain why the Sephardi community embraced the modernization process in some countries like Egypt, and why the wealthy families of Sephardi community in Alexandria, on behalf of their community, wrote to the Alliance asking the organization to establish schools in Egypt. As the administration had to be run efficiently and men had to be trained in the knowledge of Western language and other Western skills, the European schools were founded to carry out these tasks. Its goal was to prepare and graduate future administrators and officials who could translate foreign language and would be familiar with the Western administrative techniques. However, Egyptian rabbis began to closely associate themselves with European Jewish organizations, including, as I said above, the Alliance Israelita Universelle. Many rabbis studied in the Alliance's schools, which led to the Alliance's curriculum having an impact on the curriculum of the subsequent rabbinical community schools established in Egypt. Furthermore, the Alliance's influence on school curricula was spread by rabbis who taught at both the religious and European schools. For example, the last chief rabbi of Egypt, Rabbi Haim Musa Dweck, was a student of these schools, and he was born actually in Aleppo and moved to Egypt. I studied also the transformation from Arabic into Hebrew in Egypt and the dissemination of the Hebrew language, modern Hebrew in Jewish schools. Jewish intellectuals in Egypt of both communities, the Rabbinic and the Karaite, began the process of dissemination and teaching of Hebrew as part of the nascent Zionist current, which was influential in Jewish communities and was discussed in their published newspaper, which I mentioned above, Israel, Al-Shams, Al-Ittihad Al-Israeli, and Al-Kalim. The process of revival was formed under the influence of the ideas of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who had adopted 7 principles in order to revive the language. This were one, establishing Hebrew as the primary language spoken at home; 2, encouraging adoption of the Hebrew language by the diaspora and local populations; 3, forming Hebrew-speaking societies; 4, teaching Hebrew at Hebrew schools; 5, establishing Hebrew language newspaper; 6, creating a dictionary of the Hebrew language, both ancient and modern; and 7, developing a language council. The newspapers, for example, of the Qarrati community, Al-Ittihad Al-Israeli, gives more information about their efforts for disseminating and teaching of Hebrew, and shows that they carried out their efforts with a great determination as part of their project for reviving Jewish identity, supporting Zionist leaning among Egyptian Jews. I have to actually do something for my computer, excuse me. The rabbinical community recognized the significant role in the dissemination of Hebrew through education and support of Zionism, of Zionist cultural institutions. It could also participate in establishing schools because of the economic opportunities that it had in Egypt. The motives for the dissemination of Hebrew as a national language were in line with those of the Zionist movement, and that is also why Hebrew was taught in Jewish schools. But like other minorities, Jewish families didn't previously insist that their children speak Hebrew fluently. Religious schools are the models of schools in Egypt. Jewish schools had 2 models, European international and religious, similar to those that dominated among Western European Jewry. Most schools were under the effective control of rabbis, which in turn worked under the direction of Rabbi Ovadia Yusuf. The religious schools fell into 2 categories, Cheder and Yeshiva schools, and the elementary or secondary schools, Hebrew language schools. And here, at this point, actually, this is a very interesting point to explain or to study the role of Rabbi Ovadia Yusuf in Egypt, who spent around 3 or 4 years in Egypt and had a strong ties also with the official or with the governor in Egypt, especially with the Egyptian former president Hosni Mubarak. In conclusion, the Jewish communities in Egypt were the spiritual center of Jewry in the Middle East and North Africa because of this clear positioning within the region. Many Jews formed from different Arab countries came to Egypt to study or teach at the Jewish schools. Furthermore, because of the privileged financial situation of the Sephardic group in Egypt, they were able to bankroll and offer help to the Jewish colonization in Palestine. In this context, it is clear why Rabbi Ovadia Yusuf, for example, came to Egypt and how the Sephardic community in Egypt could be involved in establishing schools in Palestine. This gives the Sephardic group a type of hegemonic position and increased the influence of Sephardic culture. Since the beginning of the connection between Egyptian Jews and Yishuv, these Sephardic groups played a significant role in supporting the Yishuv system at various levels, and interconnectedness grows steadily. The efforts of the working classes cooperated with the Haute bourgeoisie, the elite, in the teaching and dissemination of the Hebrew language. Despite their differences, the Jewish communities held together generally and provided the symbolic institutional continuity of Jewish national cultural identity. The establishment of many Jewish schools funded by the emerging wealthy Jewish business class, including both rabbinic and Qarrati Jews. Newspaper played a major role in spreading Zionist ideas, including the importance of the Hebrew language. The Qarrati community required Jewish Egyptian families seeking to immigrate to Palestine to learn Hebrew, available in all Jewish schools. The financial support of the Egyptian Jews was not restricted to covering the building of schools, but as mentioned above, was extended to include voluntary contribution for establishing the Hebrew University. At this stage, I finished the presentation of my book, and welcome for all questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taqadum Al-Khatib. This was very interesting presentation about the Jewish in Egypt. I will start by two questions, and then we will continue. The first question, how, or could you please tell us more in details how the Jewish in Egypt perceive the modernity as a project, as a Western project, how they react to it, what is the different, more in details about the elite, normal Jewish people, how is their approach to modernity as a Western project. The second question is about you know, Zionism as a movement, it has to have sub-organization, militant sub-organization like Haganah, Ergon. So what was, like, I am not sure about this, but what did you find in your study, for example, a connection between Egypt, Jewish Egyptian connection with the sub-militant organization in the Zionism?
Yeah, thanks for these questions. First of all, I think so that I said that Egyptian Jews at that time tried to participate in the Nahda discourse, but actually, you know that the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe impacted the discourse of the Arab Jews, because anyway they are Arab actually, and they embraced the concept of enlightenment, European enlightenment, and they tried to Arabize or to do something like to produce this concept on the way of the Egyptian society, or in the way of the Jewish Egyptian Jews. That's, I mean, they focused on the term of Islah, because this term Islah used in another discourse, and it focused on language, religion, society, government, education, or family. And for example, as I said, we have several Jewish intellectuals like Murad Faraj Bey. He was actually a very prominent intellectual, and he published several books in several languages. He participated in Al-Nahda and the social reforms, and he took up upon himself the task of reforming the social and religious structure of Jewish community. For example, despite the proximity of the two communities, Karaite and Rabbanite religious leaders in Egypt banned intermarriage between the two communities, which Faraj personally opposed and worked to reverse. This is actually was the contribution of the Jewish community toward what's called Al-Nahda. The second example was the Sephardic community, who invited on behalf of their community, I mean here the upper class, invited the Western European schools to Egypt, also to learn or to open schools in Egypt for actually for European language, and to support also the administrative system in Egypt. I hope that I answered these questions. The second part of the questions about Haganah, I think so, yeah?
Whether there is a relationship between the Egyptian Jewish and the militant organization, the militant Zionism organization, like Haganah, for example.
Okay. I didn't find anything actually about that in the newspapers or in the archives documentations, but I found a lot of information related to the Egyptian Jews or the Egyptian intellectuals who supported the Zionist movement, and they also invested a lot of money actually to rebuild the Jewish schools in Palestine, and also to build the Hebrew University. They participated in the building of the Hebrew University. But actually, with the Haganah and Egyptian Jews, I didn't find any information about that.
Interesting. Okay, I read here one of the question. Can you comment on the influence of a prominent Jewish Egyptian families and Zionism, and their influence on a prominent Egyptian elite? Also, had Egyptian Zionists play any role in establishing the state of Israel?
Yeah. I said that the Egyptian Jews, actually the intellectual of the Sephardi Jewish community, played actually a strong role in establishing the Israeli society in Palestine, which called the Yishuv. And they also sent a delegation to Palestine, and they established also several Hebrew schools, and they participated in the story of the problem of language, or the so-called Sprachkampf, a language debate spread among Egyptian Jewry alongside a project of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, because it was it was like a problem of the language of education in at the Hebrew University schools, which will be German, will be Hebrew. And the Egyptian Zionists also participated and said they want the Hebrew language to be the language of education at the Hebrew University. But and as I said also, it was a problem to the Egyptian Jews between Zionism and the Egyptian nationalism, the embracing of Zionism or the embracing of the Egyptian nationalism. And as I said also, in the Egyptian nationalism, it was like that. It was several intellectuals participated in both national movements, Zionism and nationalism. As example, as I said, Leon Castro, who conducted the propaganda for the Wafd Party in Europe after the 1919 nationalist uprising, and founded and edited a pro-Wafd French language newspapers. And also we have another example for the Felix Ben Zakin. I explained also about him, or who had participated in the national movement, Egyptian national movement, and were the representative of Jewish Agency of Palestine in Egypt. And he was also the member of the Wafd, a deputy in parliament, member of the Alexandria Rabbinical Court, and president of the Zionist organization of Alexandria, Al-Otwans. And despite his Zionist commitments, Ben Zakin remained in Egypt until 1960, when he immigrated to the United States. And I remember also that the last rabbi of the Egyptian Jews actually refused to engage with the Zionist movement, but he left Egypt in 1960 also. So we have several information. Some intellectuals participated in two movements, and another intellectuals like the communist, or who established the communist movement in Egypt in order to counter the Zionist movement. They refused to engage with the Zionist movement. And for example, we have Yusuf Darwish, who converted later to Islam, and he published his newspapers in order to counter the Zionist movement. So both of them, we had the two orientations in Egypt. First of all, the Zionism and the intellectual who supported Zionism, and nationalism, and the intellectual who supported nationalism, and the intellectual who participated into movement, as I said and explained with with Felix Ben Zaki and another intellectuals.
Okay, there is a question asking about Levon affair in 1950. I'm not sure what is this exactly.
Levon, you mean the
Levon,
Levon?
yes. So maybe you could tell us more about this. So the question says, some historians argue that many Egyptian Jewish were not Zionist, which promoted the Levon affair in 1950. What are your findings on this question?
I didn't study this period actually because my study began with the 1915 until 1952. And as I remember, Levon was in 1954 actually, and its members belonged to the Jewish agency in Egypt. And I don't have a lot of information about it, and I didn't study also this information. So maybe in the future, when I'm going to write an essay about that or an article about that, maybe I will utilize my resources, which I collected from several archives. I don't have new information about it.
Okay. There is a question about Hayy al-Yahud, which say many people argue about the significance of certain future prominent Egyptian living in the Jewish neighborhood, Hayy al-Yahud. In your study, is there any evidence that these Egyptian notable having a Zionist leaning?
Yeah, actually, I said, because as you know, I remember actually that the Zionist leaders, Chaim Weizmann and others, visited Egypt actually in order to observe the life conditions of Egyptian Jews. And I remember in 1926, the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann visited Egypt with a delegation actually of education experts to discuss with the Egyptian Jews. The delegation visited the schools and the Jewish neighborhood. It's called in Arabic Harat al-Yahud in Muski and Gamaliya. The Karaite community, especially in Egypt, lived in this place, and they don't have a lot of they didn't actually gain the support from the Egyptian state, so they supported strongly the Zionist movement, and they participate or took place in this movement. So we have a new information about the Karaite community in Egypt, that they supported strongly the Egyptian, the Zionist movement, and they had also a strong ties with the Zionist leader like Chaim Weizmann and others.
Okay, maybe one more question. I'm not sure, like I'm not expert on this issue, but the question is like, can we compare this to a Jewish minority in other Arab countries? Like, is it, or you didn't look at this? For example, the Jewish in Morocco, is there like a similarity in how the elites, the languages, the culture, all of this issue that you're discussing in your book, or you're more focused only on Egypt?
Yeah, because my topic also about Egypt. I have written my dissertation, as I said, about Egypt. But as I said, when I studied the establishing of the Jewish schools in Egypt, I said that the Egyptian elite in Egypt, especially from the Sephardi community, invited the European language, the European organization to build a new schools in Egypt. And as I said also that the Alliance Israelite Universelle, this was a large French schools established by the Jewish in France. And they tried also to publish or disseminate the French culture. They had a strong also ties, or they disseminated strongly the French culture in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, also because Algerian was under the French occupation. But in Egypt, they tried actually to spread the European culture. And so maybe the similarity actually between the Jews in Morocco and Egypt in the process of westernization, which formed the general context in which the modern encounter between the West North African Sephardim and Eastern Jewish communities of the Muslim world took place. So this is only the only thing that I found in my study. And I think so that the alliance as an organization tried also to train or to carry out several goals in Egypt to prepare and graduate future administrators and officials who could translate foreign language and would be familiar with Western administrative techniques. This is only the same thing that I found. But actually, we have also several Jewish members who immigrated from Morocco to Egypt and spoke several languages. And as I said, the Egyptian, the upper class was educated at good schools and spoke several languages, especially European languages. And the middle class spoke French as the first foreign language of choice, in addition Ladino, and I think so Ladino it is a Hebrew language with a French language or European language. So we had also several members in Egypt who spoke this dialect actually. So this was the only similar that I can talking about it.
Okay, I think that was a great presentation about your book. I hope the people who cannot access to the German language, they can at least listen to it till the English book is published, as well as the Arabic book is published. Thank you again, and of course, congratulations again for the book. It's a good publishing place. Now I will turn to Dr. Sami. I think he will comment. And yeah, again, thank you. And I will. Dr. Sami. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I want to thank Taqadum and Helga for these excellent presentations. I really appreciate the intents in both presentations. It was really great, particularly that this literature is not available in English or Arabic. So to expose our audience and those who are interested in these issues to these publications were very important. I just want to say something about the Levon affair. Of course, the Levon affair was an attempt by the Israeli Mossad in the 1950s to entice Egyptian Jews to immigrate. It really had two purposes. One is to entice Egyptian Jews who refused to go to Israel to immigrate to go. And secondly, to poison the relationship at that time between the United States and Egypt, since the US was warming up during the Eisenhower administration to Nasser and his colleagues in hope that they can get them to their camp during the Cold War. And of course, it was exposed, and it wasn't a fiasco, because the two agents who were trying to pin it on the regime were caught in a movie theater with burn on their hands. They were trying to bomb it, and of course they had to admit to the fact that they were Mossad. So that was one of the things, and they did it the same throughout Arab capitals, particularly in Iraq and other places. I wish Helga was here just to say a few words about her presentation. I think it was a great presentation. I think the issue of armed resistance, we need to distinguish between its legality and viability. And I think she made it in her answer that this was legitimate under international law. Whether it's viable or not viable, she left that question to the Palestinians to ask. Of course, people are pondering whether the armed struggle by itself is capable of liberating Palestine, or is it just a defensive mechanism. At any rate, I'm glad that she explained that point and clarified her position. The issue, of course, regarding BDS and others, these are tactics, certainly, and tactics could come and go, and BDS has confirmed itself to be a viable tactic that has a lot of support throughout the world. And I think it's one of the tactics that would become more and more popular. Even the Zionists in different countries, particularly in the United States and other Western countries, are trying to ban it and make it anti-Semitic. But I think it's gaining traction, particularly now with the notion that Israel has become, if not since its existence, at least in the past few years, to be recognized as an apartheid state, where it has two sets of laws and two sets of environment, one for the occupied and one for the occupier. I don't want to take too much time. I think we reached our 6 o'clock. Again, I want to thank both of our presenters and thank the audience. And hopefully for those who haven't heard these excellent presentations, they will find them on our website. They can go ahead and listen to them. Thank you, Fadi, and thank you, Taqadum.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Sam. Thank you so much.
Inshallah, we hope to see you in Istanbul. Okay, thank you everyone. Again, thank you to Dr. Helga Baumgarten and to Dr. Taqadum, Dr. Sami, and for all of you for your question and engagement. Inshallah, see you in the next month with the new book. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.